imagine in some parts of the world, they discover that they have a useful resource, and that is their only source of economic development. For one thing, they might be willing to do any type of environmental harm to get that resource. But here's another option. What if they're already poor and they're in the middle of a really vicious civil struggle? And then they find out, holy mackerel, we could fund our side of the war if we could just make some of these kids use their little tiny hands to dig through that dirt and find big chunks of these really valuable resources that the rest of the world is buying up like crazy. So if you have a certain world history class, you may have heard about coltan.
Yes.
Coltan is a really famous example, which actually is of a very small volume. There are a lot of other metals which are being mined either in a conflict zone or are being used by supporters of a civil conflict. We call those conflict resources. And the famous one that a movie was made of, again with Leonardo DiCaprio, if I might add, was called Blood Diamonds. Or Blood Diamonds?
No.
I'm sorry, you're all mumbling and I can't hear you. So the Blood Diamond is a classic example with little regulatory oversight and extreme wealth potential. If you're in a part of the world that doesn't have a lot of other opportunities to climb the economic ladder, you're just saying, hey guys, I'm not going to look, but just so you know, that chair you're sitting on is worth $1 trillion. Just thought you should know. And by the way, I'll buy one. Whatever you got to do to get one, just saying. You know, we've created a market with tremendous potential in many parts of the world where there is not a regulatory landscape to protect people or to protect the environment. So the international trade in rare resources, especially strategic resources, especially the ones that are useful to our economy, ends up having this massive peripheral impact on the poor all over the world. Apparently, a classic example was featured in NPR earlier this year. There are a number of Indonesian islands that are now believed to be the largest reserves of tin anywhere on the planet. And tin is one of the only metals which cannot be mined by large-scale machinery. It still requires a human with eyeballs and fingers. Really? So there's like a couple of Indonesian islands that are being perforated like Swiss cheese by teams of Indonesian immigrants from other islands that will just take whatever boat they can get over to those islands and just start digging holes. And then they throw out tin and they're like, hey, I got some, throw it out of the hole. And I've seen satellite photos of those islands and they just look like Swiss cheese, like a trillion little tiny tubes. They're all like human-sized holes. So people get in there and start picking the tin out of the hole. We create the market by saying, hey, we should make a new fancy battery out of lithium ions. And all of a sudden, the global price of lithium explodes. And all of a sudden, if they're fighting over a desk, well, now they've got a good way to decide that they should finally just kill each other. Because whoever owns that desk has all this one thing that's really valuable that nobody else has. And we're not looking, we'll just buy it. Those are conflict reasons. As I've said before, politics makes for some very strange bedfellows. I believe, here's my last example, then I'll move on, I promise. I think it's Kyrgyzstan is one of the world's largest suppliers of nickel, I think. So like the thing that our coins are plated. Oh, another one, New Caledonia, this little island right there. How the hell do they stay in business and get to be a first world country? They happen to have all the nickel. Okay, that was fun. Say again, friend, you having a beer now? Yeah, they did. Yeah, that part of France is really great. Okay. So if we're done with number 14, I need to move on to number 15, which is like one of our huge 3-star study goals. This is like a big whoop. Number 15 says, what are the environmental and social impacts of mining? And I have like a pretty long list, not crazy long. And I have a PowerPoint to show you about this. Remember, we're trying to keep track of environmental and social impacts of mining. And I'm going to discuss 5 different types of mining. Number 1 is placer mining. And I've said this about a zillion times this year. But remember that depending on the weight of an item, when water moves quickly, it carries it, and when the water slows down, that item will fall, right? Does that make sense to everybody? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now, please look up at my mountain. This is a river. This is erosion, because when it rains, the water will eat up the rock. And as that river is eroding seams of gold, it'll carry away in the flow of the water little tiny pebbles of gold. Like that. And those little tiny pebbles of gold can be carried by turbulent water, but of course when that water slows down a little bit, the gold will fall out of the river into what's called a placer deposit. A placer deposit is where water has slowed, so all items of a certain density will fall there. Does that make sense to everyone? That the less dense items will stay in the water, but the more dense ones would all fall at that point? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. These are called placer deposits. And gold miners, when they're panning for gold, if you're thinking about the gold rush, that's what they're looking for, placer deposits. They either remove the sediment from pools or the sediment in the stream bank. You know, like all that dirt around the river. But everybody stop. There's one critical detail you got to hear. Don't copy. The placer deposit is made by a river, whether or not the river is still there. In geologic time, we've discussed before that rivers will flood or shrink, that they'll move. We talked about this, right? Mm-hmm. So remember, if we wait a couple of glacial periods, this could be a desert now. Or this could be a tropical rainforest with a big pile of sand on top of it. Or this could be in the tundra, and it could be frozen solid. Can we agree that a placer deposit is made by a river, but that river doesn't have to be there for the deposit to stay there? Yeah. This is one of the things that shuffles the deck of geology. Okay. So in the old school style, like in the gold rush, you've got some dudes with some like shovels and pickaxes digging away at streams in the Sierras. That's a relatively small impact. But I need you guys to know that the scale of mining has exploded in the last century. Like the scale of farming has exploded, or the scale of retail establishments has exploded. the amount of mining done at an individual mine is utterly mind-boggling. I'll show you some pictures at the very end of our lecture today that are basically impossible for your brain to put into scale. Okay. The major impacts you see up there are deforestation, development in the tundra, and mercury pollution. I'll spell all of those out for you in this PowerPoint. First, I don't know if you guys understand how this works, but if you look behind those three gold rush miners, you'll notice that they're digging into the stream bank. They're cutting into the riparian habitat. So if the river flows where you're sitting, the water has deposited sand, and we have found gold in the sand on the sides of the river. Does that make sense to everybody? So the deposit builds up on the side where the floodplain is. So when the river's low, I want to cut away this dirt. And back then we did that with shovels. I want to break up the rocks, so we do that with a pickaxe. And then all of that powdered material goes into that tray, that thing that looks like a horse trough there. That is set at a very careful angle. The angle is adjustable, so you'll notice these are almost always on top of a sawhorse. The reason that the angle has to be adjustable is we want the water to carry away the sand, but we want the gold to fall in that water before the water leaves. Does that make sense to everyone? So this is set up so that the water speed is just right for carrying sand, but just too slow for carrying the gold. If we make it too steep, the gold will tumble out too. And if we make it too shallow, the gold will be covered up with the sand because the water's not carrying the sand. Does that make sense? So you set the angle so the sand is carried, but the gold is not. And then you just start to take out the stream bank. A lot of times they'll use a pan so they can see if there's a mix of gold in the sand, and once they find that, they use shovels to put that all into the separator. My best friend from junior high school is an amateur gold miner. And, I mean, he, works for Caltrans for a living. He's a geologist, but he, tells Caltrans, that rock's going to fall. Or, oh, that rock fell. That's his job. and then on the weekend, he gets up into the Sierras, and he goes hey, Daniel, can I give you 10% of all the gold I find on the river cutting through your property? And then he'll tow one of these things. I don't know if it's exactly like this. And that's basically a water pump with an auger and a grinder in it. So I don't know if you can see it, but there's a fire hose on the left of the tube. See right there? And so he'll drag that hose up the river, find a place that he thinks looks good, open up the fire hose and go boom. And they just literally erode away all of that soil. So you can imagine one environmental impact is sediment pollution because of all that suspended material in the water. And all that mud goes into his machine. It stirs up the mud, and coming out of one side is mud, and coming out of one hopper is little nuggets of gold. I don't think he's made a lot of money or anything. I think he's had a couple good days, but it's probably better to be a gambler. He's not very good at poker, I can tell you that. But like I said earlier, you don't need a river to be there, and the scale has grown. Today, humans are really expensive, not just for purchase, but humans are expensive just for salary and insurance, and they unionize, and they don't like to work at night, they don't like to work on Sundays because of their bogus religious needs. So humans are a hassle, and labor is tough. But machines are cheap. You buy them once, they don't complain. When you don't like them, you can just